You want me to use this? Okay. Shall we start? Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. We are pleased to welcome all of you in our 37th book discussion session. We have invited Professor Jonathan Laurence, who is from Boston College, for talking about his book, which is Coping with Defeat, Sunni Islam and Roman Catholicism. Professor Jonathan Laurence has been kind enough to accept our invitation and be here in person and talk about his wonderful work. A brief introduction about Jonathan Laurence. Jonathan Laurence received a BA summa cum laude from Cornell University, a CEP at Sciences Pro, and an MA and PhD in government from Harvard University. His principal areas of teaching and research are comparative politics and religion and politics in Western Europe, Turkey, and North Africa. Professor Lawrence's latest book is Coping with Defeat, Sunni Islam, Roman Catholicism, and the Modern State, which has been published by Princeton University Press in 2021. Previously, he has also written about a topic which is turned into a project and a book called The Emancipation of Europe's Muslims, which was again published by Princeton University Press. And he received awards for Best Book in Religion and Politics and Migration and Citizenship from the American Political Science Association. His first book, Integrating Islam, Religious and Political Challenges in Contemporary France, co-authored with Justin Isa, was published by Brookings Institution Press in 2006 and named an outstanding academic title by Choice magazine. Professor Laurence is an affiliate of the Center for European Studies at Harvard. His PhD thesis in political science was awarded by American Political Science Association's Harold D. Lasswell Prize in 2006 as the best dissertation in public policy, completed in 2004 or 2005. He's a former fellow of the American Academy in Berlin, Transatlantic Academy at the German Marshall Fund. And while talking about his book, which has become a point of discussion in academia in the Muslim world as well as in the non-Muslim world, I'll offer a brief overview of the book, and after that, I'll request Professor Jonathan to start his presentation. Professor Jonathan talks about, and the crux and the essence of the book, which revolves around that he invokes and he asserts that throughout the medieval and early modern periods, Catholic and Sunni Islamic religious authorities had substantial spiritual and secular power over the flock. The papacy governed a large swath of central Italy, and the church was by far the largest landowner in Europe. In various Muslim empires in North Africa and the Middle East, religious authorities played a central role in legitimating rule and was independent from secular power. But then he talks about, which also comes in his title of the book, these three defeats. He talks about the end of empire. Then he also talks about the rise of the nation state. And then he also talks about this mass migration of Muslims and the non-Muslims, primarily Muslims to the West. And then how Muslims engage with these questions, with these new challenges. So before going further, I would request Dr. Jonathan Laurence to talk about his book and his interesting project. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much to you, Narashteen. Thank you to all of you for being here and for following online. It's a pleasure to be at the Sabahattin Zion University. I'm very happy to discover it in person, and I'm grateful for the hospitality. So thank you. When it comes to the public image of Islam in international news, it's being shared. Yeah. When it comes to the public image of Islam in international news, the 2020s have not felt much further along than the 1990s. Just wonder, is there a way for them in the room to also see the slides? I'm a bit... Sorry, thank you. I will begin again. When it comes to the public image of Islam in international news, the 2020s have not felt much further along than the 1990s. There was last year's raid on an Al-Qaeda leader. There was an attempted murder of Salman Rushdie. There was the triumph of the Taliban in Afghanistan. And events over the past generation, first during the war on terror and then during the disappointing Arab Spring, exacerbated long-standing fears about the capacity of Islam to adapt to the modern world. On the other hand, even in modern democratic Muslim nations operating under secular law, religion remains largely under state control. Is there something about the Islamic religion, as the scholar Bernard Lewis asked after 9/11, that, quote, the Islamic world seemingly failed to modernize or keep pace with the West, end quote? Some point to the essential unity of religion and politics in Islam. For example, the alliances between rulers and the Islamic scholars known as the ulama, or they point to the lack of a Protestant Reformation. It is also sometimes contrasted with Christianity, which some say was destined for the separation of politics and religion, ranging from the biblical citation to render unto Caesar that which is Caesar's. But I contend that none of these is actually quite right. Because a century ago, the same things that are being said now about Islam were then considered to be universal truths about the Roman Catholic Church. For example, that it resisted the authority of the modern state, as well as pluralism and liberalism. And in the USA, many saw Catholic immigrants as a threat to state-church separation, especially to public education and to family law. And this was unusually problematic after the Italian kingdom's capture of the Papal States and Rome, when for 60 years, the Pope fought to restore his power. And there you can see a group of papal zouaves who were, if you like, foreign fighters recruited from across the Catholic world and minority Catholic populations to defend the Papal States against the Italian patriots. Meanwhile, anarchist attacks in Catholic countries and by Catholic immigrants in the United States linked political violence and terrorism in the public imagination with a Roman Catholic background. Although scholars have, of course, stressed the large differences between Islam and Christianity, there are many similarities also between their historical trajectories. And the premise of my book is that it is illuminating to compare them, even if they're not perfectly analogical. To start with the basics, as you can see on these maps, they expanded in the same geographic area, just a few centuries apart. And they were not merely religions, as Miraj has just said, but they were also political empires. And as such, they organized transnational hierarchical networks. Each spiritual leader also had millions of political subjects. And both have long struggled with the modern state, which deprived them of political power and challenged their organizational autonomy. How did they lose so much power and yet salvage such an important role in providing spiritual guidance to nearly half of the world's population? Well, I argue that it is helpful to think of this process in terms of three defeats. Each defeat cut off religious authorities from believers who were stranded under another rule of law. The first defeat is the end of the political religious empire. And here I compare the Protestant Reformation with the unraveling of the Ottoman Empire. The second defeat came at the hands of the modern nation state, which the Catholic and Muslim worlds experienced 1 century apart in the mid-19th and mid-20th centuries. And the third defeat is the era of unexpected mass migration, when millions of Catholics came to the United States and millions of Muslims migrated to Europe after World War II. Each defeat provoked an institutional response from Catholic and Islamic authorities, respectively, what I call a religious counter-movement that emphasized not politics or executive roles, but rather the organization of prayer and of ritual. And while this was done in a spirit of resistance, it was actually the first step towards surviving the encounter with the modern nation state. Each phase also brought the principal religious authorities closer to coexistence with the rule of law by forcing them to operate under another political authority where they could not impose their will. Now, the process that had been underway within the Ottoman Empire was interrupted by decades of European occupation, and of course by the Turkish Republic's abolition of the Caliphate in 1924. So, whereas the Vatican survived, the Caliphate, of course, did not. And the consequences of these decisions are still felt today. There is extreme fragmentation in the former Ummah, both along new national boundaries and also along newly redefined sectarian lines that previously were not emphasized. Another consequence of this is that Islam remains under state administration, although in the 21st century, I will show that there have been significant moves towards a rebalancing of that state-religion relationship. Now, looking back 150 years, one would have expected a different outcome. While the Pope was barricading himself in the Vatican and insulting Western democracies, the Sultan was courting them and asserting a place for Islam within the international state system. So what accounts then for this apparent reversal of attitudes towards the state? Well, I argue that much of what is seen as, quote, essential to these religions is actually the product of recent history linked to 2 contingent outcomes from the 1920s when they parted ways. The Pope maintained home rule and a sovereign parcel of land, facilitating his transformation from executive to spiritual ruler, while Islam lost its caliph, who was ousted from Mecca, ousted from Medina and Jerusalem, and of course, exiled from Istanbul. How and why did it come to this? Well, we need to quickly revisit history to the moment when each religion suffered its first defeat. For the modern Catholic Church, that was the Reformation, when a set of Reformed churches rose up across Northern Europe and declared their independence from Rome. The Counter-Reformation aimed to stop those losses, and this marked a turning point for a professional global church. Dioceses were expanded around the world. New seminaries and colleges were created to train priests and students. And a congregation for propaganda fide, as it was called, the propagation of the faith, was established to oversee the religious life of Catholics outside of Catholic rule. But the church did not embrace defeat, it instead tried to use these tools to formally aim for reconquest of souls. Now, for the Islamic counterpart, the Ottoman Empire underwent a comparable loss of territory and of millions of believers to European rule in the 19th century, as European governments chipped away at North Africa, the Balkans, and of course, elsewhere in the Muslim world. This led to a situation in which nearly 2/3 of the world's Muslims lived under French, British, and Dutch rule. And in their own terms, the colonial powers set upon a policy of, quote, returning the caliphate to the Arabs, end quote, after centuries of Ottoman influence and leadership. They cut off all seminaries, courts, and religious foundations from Istanbul, whether that was in Jerusalem or in India or in the Dutch East Indies or Middle East or North Africa. And the European occupiers replaced the caliph in the religious lives of their new subjects with new national leadership. And they enforced this all the way down to Friday prayers. And here you can see just two of the religious figures who were promoted by the French and British empires. And in the case of the Mufti of Jerusalem, the British simply created a position in order to replace the influence of Istanbul. Now, as the Ottomans lost territory and came under increasing pressure, they took a page from the Counter-Reformation. Their defeat, in other words, led to an expansion of their role in global Islamic affairs. And here you can see how spending increases almost in time with the loss of each territory to European invasion. And this also corresponds, of course, to the reception of millions of refugees from Russian-speaking lands, which came under the control of the Russian Empire and created a major refugee stream to Turkey. So Istanbul professionalized its clerical establishment. And of course, this policy is familiar to all of us as Pan-Islam. But I would like to think about Pan-Islam a bit differently than usual. The Pan-Islamic policies actually pushed Abdul Hamid II closer to spiritual status as a global prayer leader and away from a political executive role over believers. He was not expected to actually send the armies or military battalions to save Muslims from their invaders. Instead, he focused on their spiritual and ritual practice, which was more realistic. Now, of course, the caliph was the Islamic ruler with sovereignty over the holiest sites in Mecca and Medina and Jerusalem. And his stature drew in part from his status as the only major Muslim land not under European occupation. But Ottoman influence extended well beyond territories that the Ottomans ever actually controlled or governed, all the way to India, to South Africa, and to the Dutch East Indies, with a new cast of sheikhs, seminaries, Sharia courts, and the like. This Ottoman outreach helped Muslims to lead religiously observant lives by sponsoring a global network of mosques, seminaries, and courts. And as with the papacy, even as the number of individual subjects declined that were formerly under Ottoman rule, the Ottoman caliphs commandeered the hearts and minds of hundreds of millions of followers who were beyond their literal government. Of course, the Turkish Republic, as you see depicted on the right there, abolished the longest lasting modern caliphate in 1924. But I argue in the book that that was merely a formality, because the actual networks were fatally weakened by the European occupations around the world anyway. And this is where the trajectories of the two religions really begin to diverge. So to bring this divergence into focus, I think we need to look at how each religion responded to the second defeat, which was the rise of the nation state and of secular law. Now, while the first defeat, you'll recall, was dealt by external actors, the second defeat was inflicted internally on religious establishments by national governments with secular agendas. For Catholicism, this took place through something called the Civil Constitution of the Clergy in France, the Kulturkampf in Germany, where the church was brought under the control of newly created ministries of the interior, which appropriated church property and took over the nomination of priests, bishops, and cardinals. This ended church privileges, as well as its role in affairs of education, justice, or indeed the holding of political office. Now, the church responded, on the one hand, with the syllabus of errors, with the First Vatican Council, and of course, with the army of Zouaves that I pointed out earlier. But they also built schools and dioceses at record rates worldwide, so that in the depths of isolation, the Pope actually expanded his spiritual influence abroad. After 6 decades of military and political conflict, the Roman question was finally resolved by the Lateran Accords, creating the Vatican city-state. This was an elegant reply to the question of papal sovereignty. Significantly, it allows the Pope to exert temporal powers over around 1,000 or so citizens. But since then, the church also recovered its internal autonomy nearly everywhere, again, nominating its own bishops and starting down a path of what I call soft restoration, running its own schools, its own seminaries, and of course, its own civil society organizations. Now, contrast that with the fragmented nature of Islam after the end of the Caliphate, when the leadership of Islam passed to the Islamic affairs ministries of individual nations. Echoing the anti-clericalism of Catholic statesmen in Europe, Muslim statesmen in Sunni countries also appropriated religious properties, and they also pushed traditional hierarchies out of public life and from their roles in education, justice, and morality. But in this case, there was no independent spiritual authority that could counteract to or adapt to this process. Now, at first, the nation states were inadequate custodians of Islam. In the early years of their independence, for example, the Republic of Turkey and Tunisia completely cut spending and let Islamic institutions die out. So here you can see the collapse of religious education and administration in Turkey during the first 25 years of the Republic, where there was essentially no personnel that could assure Friday prayers, that could assure Islamic burials, because there simply were not enough mosques in operation or personnel on the payroll. They had all been eliminated. Now, over time, of course, this left average citizens in all of the countries that followed similar policies open to other claimants to Islamic authority and open to competing political agendas. So as domestic threats grew, the state apparatus across the region grew with it. Here you can see the timing of Diyanet's growth in the 20th century, which immediately followed a series of coups d'etat and corresponded with a clamping down on domestic politics. This was also, of course, happening in the context of international challenges, such as after 1979, the exportation of revolutionary ideology from the Islamic Republic of Iran, and in response, the expansion of Salafi Wahhabism from Saudi Arabia, as well as the spread of non-state networks, of course, such as the Muslim Brotherhood. And national governments found that the less they invested in religion, the more their citizens were vulnerable to other cross-border influences. And so as threats grew, the state religious apparatus experienced its first expansion in the 1980s, early 1990s. But at this time, it was heavily managed by security and interior officials, and they were mostly concentrating on repressive activities. It was not actually a genuine rebalancing of the state-religion relationship. Relatedly, let's consider the impact of the third defeat, which is the era of mass migration, which also coincided with periods of international terrorism. While these religions were locked in combat with secular states at home, each also saw the unexpected growth of minority diaspora communities overseas in the US and Europe 100 years apart. Suddenly, millions of Catholics and millions of Muslims lived beyond quote unquote enemy lines, where they lacked strong religious institutions and were susceptible to other influences. In each case, thousands of political refugees and violent extremists also came and also cultivated an audience in this pool of labor migrants. Now, in the United States, the church adapted by building more churches, more schools, more dioceses. But even when there were 10 million Catholics in the US by the end of the 1800s, all of this activity took place in the missionary congregation of Propaganda Fide. And what this meant was that US Catholicism was heavily influenced by the foreign interests of homeland networks in Europe. And these organizations are created specifically to aid immigrants from Europe in the United States directly from European cities. There are two assassinations that would change the course of Catholic history. The first was the assassination of the Italian King Umberto in the year 1900. He was killed by a New Jersey anarchist who had been born in Italy. In the following year, US President McKinley was assassinated by a second-generation Polish American. Now, these attacks were not religiously inspired, but authorities linked the radicalization of young Catholic men to the absence of any religious background. The response was that the number of clerical visas for Catholic priests to come to the United States and minister to these communities skyrocketed. And at this moment of crisis, the US President, Theodore Roosevelt, opted against engaging the apostolic delegate who had been sent from Rome, and instead he engaged with the American Cardinal Gibbons, who represented the Americanist school of Catholicism at the time. Now, this was the beginning of a really crucial process of adaptation, because Rome recognized more US-based seminaries to ordain American clergy, and they slowly ended the importation of priests. And shortly after that, US Catholicism exited from the Congregation for Propaganda Fide, which means that the Vatican granted US Catholics their own hierarchy operating under canon law, and was no longer simply treated as a missionary outgrowth of the countries of origin. Quickly, an American-born hierarchy came to replace the papal representatives. And together with the Vatican city-state that I already mentioned, these steps prepared the church for its current international role and for the recovery of many of its former roles in civil society that were initially seized by the state. So how does this compare with Islam in Europe? Well, the arrival of Muslims in Europe in the late 20th century also coincided with violent political conflicts in the countries of origin, which also spilled over into the diaspora. And religious authorities in the countries of origin also delayed accepting the permanence of these diasporas, and instead have treated them as a missionary branch without local autonomy. So when terrorist attacks struck European capitals, authorities discovered that those who had committed the violence usually had received no formal religious education whatsoever. Now, to counter the spread of extremism, the European governments worked closely with descending states, Turkey, North Africa among them, to import prayer leaders and to build more mosques. But here's where differences emerge with US Catholicism. The integration of Islam in Europe had been marked by extreme ambivalence on the part of the European hosts. While European governments embrace the quote unquote Europeanist schools of Islam, they also reject any enduring foreign influences in the same diaspora communities. They are deeply uncomfortable with the role played by homeland religious institutions, like the Turkish Diyanet or the Moroccan Habuz ministry in European religious life. Ironically, European governments continue to rely on imams who are trained elsewhere, and there is an ongoing shortage. Now, the phase of this third defeat has been especially important for two reasons. The first is that it has taken place during the rapid growth of national Islamic authorities in the Muslim majority states. They have developed specialized roles in religious service provision and become enthusiastic enforcers of their own monopoly over religious affairs. Now, unlike during the previous growth of Islamic services that I described in the late 20th century, this time around is not purely repressive. Since spending has increased dramatically, there are now many more trained religious professionals, imams, teachers, ulema. This has, however, been somewhat unequal across regions. Just to take my case studies, as you can see here, there are at least two echelons of religious professionalization. In the first, there is Turkey and Morocco, who are relatively high spenders with relatively lower ratios of mosques and personnel to believers. And in the other side, there are Tunisia and Algeria, which spent a lot less and had a lot fewer mosques and a lot fewer imams per capita. Now, there is a visual correlation on the one hand between having a larger diaspora abroad and higher spending domestically on the one hand. And there's also a correlation between less effectively fighting violent extremism and spending lower on Islamic affairs on the other. Here's another view of this same set of countries and their spending disparities. And this is a more detailed view of state-sponsored mosques and imams in 21st century Turkey. Now, I argue that this increase in spending has had great significance for the state-Islam relationship. Sometimes the increase in spending has simply been a matter of keeping pace with population growth. So here you can see that even during the heart of AKP rule in Turkey, the proportion of mosques and imams per 10,000 citizens did not actually change very dramatically. That much of the hyped construction was simply keeping up with population. But there has also clearly been an increase in spending per person, as seen here. So something more is going on. So I argue in the book that the 21st century Islam policies have started to change the place of religion within Muslim majority democracies, leading to the first instances of what you might call a soft restoration. Again, this follows the 20th century phase of interior ministry control over Islam, which back then was combined with severe underfinancing of prayer spaces and of religious education. So under what I call soft restoration, we see more natural proportions of mosques and personnel to believers. We see the depenalization of headscarf wearing, the resumption of religious education. Here you can see Imam Hatib and Quran course enrollment in the first years of the 21st century. These had, of course, been unnaturally suppressed in the 1990s, and they are now being given an extra push. Of course, the natural level is probably somewhere in between. Other aspects of soft restoration, which I've listed here, which are, I think, of interesting relevance, have to do with devolution of the ministries of religious affairs in certain of their activities, such as allowing for the local election of muftis instead of direct nomination from the political capital, or such as allowing for eased rules in religious marriages and how promptly they have to be reported to state authorities. So this is part of what I see as a slow giving back of religious autonomy to the believers, even as it coincides with an increase in state spending and bureaucracy. The book is filled with data and charts that try to provide empirical bases for what I've been saying, and so you can also see that in Morocco and in Algeria, recent spending has begun to make up for the suppression and closures of the previous generation. And an underappreciated aspect of this I found during my fieldwork is that there is greater autonomy for specialists within the religious affairs ministries to support religious observance. Now, because of these countries' large diasporas abroad, these national policies have also influenced the practice of Islam in Europe. Now, on the receiving side, European governments have been extremely ambivalent about this outreach, because they fear that it inhibits integration. It's worth discussing whether that is a reasonable or misplaced fear. But meanwhile, descending countries have taken steps to remove their diaspora populations from this missionary status that I was describing, allowing for greater local autonomy in the running of European Muslims' own affairs, essentially treating Europe as a permanent home, but there is still a long way to go. Europeans' concerns about foreign influences over their domestic Muslim communities provides a window onto what they see as a custody battle over international Islam in the century that has followed the abolition of the caliphate. There is no public appetite for Al-Qaeda or for ISIS, but their charismatic leaders drew attention to the caliph's empty seat. For many Muslims, the Saudi and Hashemite duopoly over Islam's holy cities is tainted by their military dependence on non-Muslim powers. And they are tainted also by their association with British occupation and imperial rule. The Muslim Brotherhood, of course, has entered a period of international suppression. Again. So what we have left then are transnational contenders for the realm of nation-state Islam. Morocco, for example, has been extremely active with its king as the commander of the Maliki faithful within its own sphere of influence over the Maliki legal tradition in Africa and, of course, the diasporas in Europe. But it is Turkey that has done the most to embody the old caliphate by building mosques and training clerics worldwide. Here you can see just one representative construction in the Balkans, but these four institutions named here, CIGA, Yunus Emre, the Yortusi Turkler, and the Diyanet Vakfi, have been spending many millions annually and arguably have something to show for it. The role of Turkey has, of course, also extended to an informal protector of Jerusalem and a beautifier of Al-Quds and Al-Aqsa. So these authorities have also played a prominent leadership role internationally that goes well beyond their own diaspora population. And these practices suggest the potential for a less fragmented ummah in the future, one which operates across borders, but within still the limits of national law that come with many different legal contexts. Concretely, such policies have led to the overwhelming popularity of the Turkish president abroad. Here you can see an opinion poll taken several years ago. The lighter the color, the greater the popularity, and that is Erdogan's map on top compared with those of the deceased ISIS leader and the imprisoned Ennahda leader on the right. Now, this popularity was confirmed, I think, in the celebratory reactions to the recent Turkish elections around a lot of the Muslim world. And that enthusiasm, it's safe to say, was not mirrored in European capitals. Now, the role of Turkey in its near abroad has even greater poignancy given the success of the Taliban, who have nearly 500 million Muslims in their immediate vicinity, including many of whose religious life Turkey also aimed to shape. Ultimately, demography will help determine the fate of which movements will prevail internationally. The European empires may have, quote, returned the caliphate to the Arabs, end quote, but ethnically speaking, global Islam is, of course, now more than 3/4 non-Arab. So what constructive conclusions can we draw? Well, firstly, that religion and state benefit from a strategy of international recognition and soft restoration in civil society. Secondly, that the theological training of imams and ulama should serve not only the homeland, but also allow for the development of local autonomy within the diaspora. And finally, there is no caliph, of course, who can sign a peace treaty like the Lateran Accords of 1929, but a symbolic resolution with some of the new leadership figures and structures is possible. For without that, there is little chance for the pluralist experience of religious minorities in the West to actually reach the Muslim world. And this is the final slide and one of the central conclusions of the book, that together with the recognition of Vatican City, it was a dynamic of feedback onto the religious core from the periphery that allowed for a peaceful cohabitation of citizenship and faith, and also helped to integrate a culturally alienated group into the national community in both minority and majority Catholic settings. It allowed also for the soft restoration of traditional civil society roles that the church plays, not only granting civil effects to life cycle events, but also allowing them their role in health and education sectors more broadly. So one question is whether or not that is a satisfactory replacement for the political executive roles that it once held. But without these developments of international recognition and of soft restoration, the democratic right to free religious exercise may continue to be seen as an obstacle to political integration, when in fact, the book tries to show that it actually needs help finding its rightful place within the new order. Thank you for your time, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you so much, Professor Jonathan, for this wonderful conversation, and for this. We can all see the threadbare research which has been put in this project. And you have, before your presentation, you talked about this. You talked about this project taking 9 years and coming into fruition and coming into completion. While I was reading your book, I was also reminded of Wael Halak's book, Impossible State, and I was trying to see how your work fits into the larger project of what has happened in post-1924 in the Muslim world, and how Wael Halak goes into the genealogy of the failure and the impossibility of the existence of Muslims in the nation state. I was also looking at your book and how you historically go into the historicity of the failure of the Muslim world primarily, not talking about the Roman Catholic Church. So I was wondering that when you talk about this, primarily these 2 points of international recognition and soft restoration, do you think it has also been made impossible, which I see as a gap, as a gap in the work, and the influence of the Western powers, especially the modern nation state, and how it operationalizes or operates, how it has made it impossible for the Muslim world, in the Muslim world, for gaining this international recognition and for this soft restoration, because they have been continuously involved in making sure that this recognition doesn't come up in the right way, and this soft restoration doesn't fall in line with the major goals of the Muslim world in post-nation state. So how do you look at this one point? And also, the Carl Schmitt talks about this idea of that all significant concepts of the modern theory of the state are secularized theological concepts. So you see also that when we talk about the modern nation state, we know that it primarily also falls in line with the ontological foundations of Roman Catholicism. But Muslims have not been able to make peace with the very foundations of the modern nation state. So that is why we see that there has been an international recognition or the soft restoration of the church in the nation state framework, while as we see the failure of the Muslim world coming in tune in line with the nation state because of this foundational problem. So how do you see these two points?
No, great question and very interesting references to introduce here and absolutely relevant to this discussion. I suppose the main answer I would give is that the settlement of the Church of Rome with the nation state, with the modern state order, is now seen as something that was destined to occur. But it's very interesting when you read accounts, contemporary accounts from the 1880s to the 1920s. I mean, even into the 1950s, if you look at the concordat that the church, the same church in Rome, 1955, signed with the Spanish government, making Catholicism the sole permissible religion in Spain, completely intolerant, unable to practice any other religions. It seems really unlikely that Catholicism would ever find what I'm describing as this equilibrium. And so it really had to happen on several tracks at once. But I think that the popes of history would tell you that there is nothing organic about the nation state for Christianity. There's nothing natural about breaking up Christians into national borders. And they've rejected it. Indeed, there's a reason why the European Union, the European Commission, the European project has been so strongly supported by the Christian democratic parties of the post-war period. It's hard not to think of it as a bit of a rolling back of the national identities that, from a religious perspective, are divisive for the community of believers, whatever your community. So that's sort of the first part of the answer, is that what do we, how destined was this really for the Catholic Church? And I would say not at all. Several things had to happen. So the key elements in making that happen for me had to do with the independence of diaspora populations from the religious center, right? That's something that was resisted and rejected by Rome before it was ultimately accepted, right? They kept the United States under this very special administration directly from Rome all the way until 1908. But at a certain point, the political pressures in the United States became too great, a bit the way that the political pressures in Europe became too great for Islam to be simply directly administered from Ankara or Rabat, or where have you. So some of those conditions have begun to occur. The other two major points, though, are the Vatican City-State. Now, the Vatican City-State allowed for the Pope to be a sovereign prince under the rule of no other potentate or monarch. There was a possibility, of course, for the Palace of Yildiz to serve some kind of similar role. This was even discussed during the interwar period at a moment of British occupation of Istanbul. And there was thought about how would you essentially develop the caliph as an international spiritual figure who did not have political sovereignty over a large swath of territory, but still had political sovereignty where he operated, so that he could still be the shadow of God on earth and under no other monarch's command. Of course, between 1916 and 1924, the colonial maneuvering eliminated Istanbul as a religious actor by evicting the Ottomans from Jerusalem, from the Hijaz, and ultimately from Istanbul, thus precluding the possibility that there be a kind of international settlement of the status of the caliph. The caliph survived for 2 years, of course, between 1922 and 1924, even after the end of the Sultanate, even after the end of the empire. But every attempt to create a new religious center through caliphate conferences that took place in Cairo and Jerusalem through the 1920s and the 1930s were ultimately torpedoed. They were torpedoed largely by the Sauds and by the Kemalists, who had arguably the greatest stake in there not being a new rival caliphate. But the question of how to balance this caliphate between, quote, Arab interests and other Muslims' interests has wound up being a major obstacle to that sort of unity. So that is what I see as the second major obstacle, which is that in the absence of a religious of accepting that there are religious figures who can essentially sign a treaty or an accord on some kind and receive at least spiritual sovereignty, that leaves Muslims in a great bind today. The final part of the soft restoration that the church was able to obtain, of course, came with something that was also entirely unexpected, but the Second Vatican Council, which was only 10 years after that very restrictive concordat that the church signed with Spain. And in the early 1960s, the church became committed to pluralism and to a certain amount of religious toleration, coexistence with democracy. And that was possible largely because Catholics who had lived as a minority in various contexts had gotten so used to asking for their own rights as minorities within non-Catholic societies, they essentially had internalized some of these values just as a matter of self-preservation. And I would argue that if you look at the Muslim minority communities living in Western Europe, a lot of them have engaged in relationships with other competing religious communities, competing religious leaders that they never would have done at home or in a majority situation. And just the factual circumstances put them into this situation of coexistence, of pluralism, of toleration, that ultimately is part of what removes those last barriers of resistance in state institutions towards granting some degree of autonomy back to the religious civil society. Because those areas of autonomy that I described are extremely important in society. Education, the education sector, the health sector, these are extremely influential areas as well, where religious communities can spread their values. And it's true they're not politically sovereign, but that role in civil society arguably can be even more in sync with the spiritual mission of the community than, say, governing over a very messy polity.
If any of you have any questions, please.
Thank you very much for your presentation. Actually, I haven't had the opportunity to read the book, but based on your presentation, I have some questions. And also, when I read the title of your book, Coping with Defeat, Sunni Islam, Roman Catholicism, and the Modern State. So you made some visits and archival research in Turkey, North Africa, and Western Europe. So and my question was actually a little bit a personal question. So when we take this word defeat, and there are two different religions. One is Sunni Islam and the other is Roman Catholicism. So when these two different major religions faced the rise of modern states, actually when I have a look at the Turkish experiments, we see that establishment of modern Turkey, generally they suppressed religious pluralism. So there were, human rights violations. Some groups were demonized, and through the establishment of Diyanet, the Alevi people were also, they couldn't practice their religion freely, I think. So when we have a look at the Turkish experiment and in terms of Turkey, let's say, and when we have a look at the Western European case, the Roman Catholicism, so in terms of diminishing freedoms, in terms of undermining democracy and violating human rights, do you think that it is right to say that this defeat actually, I think, relates to Sunni Islam, because unfortunately, the state elites undermines liberties and caused human rights violations. But in terms of the other religion under scrutiny, the Roman Catholicism, I think this is not the thing that has seen the defeat. So how can we understand? If we make a comparison in terms of this concept of defeat, I think Sunni Islam, because the essence of Sunni Islam, normally it's tolerance. Salam means, love, and it has nothing to do with suppression or coercion. So I think this defeat relates to which one? Do you think that both or Sunni Islam? Of course, there are different countries, but I take the example of Turkey and Western Europe. Thanks.
Thank you. Excellent question. So the concept of defeat is deployed here to describe a situation of loss of direct control. So that can mean simply that a religious community is no longer able to impose its will, its own self-organization. And so the book describes adaptations to those defeats. So the defeats are taken as empirical events that occurred. For the phase of nation-state control, when national governments monopolize religious affairs, that is indeed a case of defeat for religious authorities, who are then caught in a combat with political powers that they cannot hope to beat, right? They can't beat them militarily. They can't beat them. They have to adapt and transform their offer, their services, into something that is able to pass over borders and that is able to operate even under a hostile rule of law. What you're describing with regard to the Diyanet and the illiberal aspects of the administration of the religion, that has complex origins. The rejection of minority trends within Islam in Turkey has to be linked to the rejection of minority identities more generally, including other non-religious identities in Turkey, because of a great sensitivity of Turkish national identity, which I am sympathetic to. On the one hand, not with the repression, I'm sympathetic with the sense of vulnerability of Turkish identity, because after all, modern Turkey, its borders were created very brutally, right? And the way that the Arab vilayets were just sort of lopped off at the end, and the way that the treaties of Lausanne and Sèvres simply said, okay, here's where this is modern Turkey, right? So I see the early Turkish nation builders as being faced with this task of, okay, now how are we going to lend some coherence to this political project? And of course, they go into overdrive and they see everything as their enemy, including just straight up everyday Sunni Islam, like everyday religious observance. What I describe in terms of how that changes, though, I think is what is maybe most of interest here, because what began as a very repressive apparatus, which it's not only that it didn't recognize the Alevi gem houses and this sort of thing. The Diyanet initially didn't even really have enough people employed to allow everyday folks to practice their mainstream religion. And thus it's only with the kind of revision of the role of Diyanet that you start to see a more three-dimensional role of religious services in the society. And the experience of the third defeat here is very important, because it's true that domestically, for their own rationale, there is a real unwillingness to recognize diversity. But the minority experience of, say, all of the DTIB organizations operating in Western Europe that have had to go to sit at tables like this with, and that, 20 years ago, it was that DTIB would never sit down with Milli Görüş. And then, even before the AKP came into power, DTIB and Milli Görüş had to start sitting around the same table in places like Cologne or Amsterdam, not because they wanted to, but because they were told by the authorities there, if you Muslim communities want to have your religious rights, some prayer leaders, some prayer spaces, some halal food, some chaplains, whatever cemeteries, you're going to have to get together and tell us what you want. We're not going to negotiate with each one of you groups. So already you have this kind of psychological opening that is forced by this situation of crisis as a minority. And that even starts to affect minorities such as different Berber or Amazigh minorities from the Arab origin countries, as well as measurable. Whereas in the 50 years before that, zero. And so the argument here is that does Recep Tayyip Erdogan want to pay the rent for the Alevi's prayer spaces? Does he want the state to pay the electricity for Alevi prayer houses? No, he doesn't. But gradually, European court decisions and lobbying pressure from outside force a kind of liberalization to take place. It's modest, it's minor, and it's nowhere near the kind of equality that Alevi groups would ask for. But it is perhaps an opening that shows a future where the religious directorate, the Directorate of Religious Affairs, is genuinely a Directorate of Religious Affairs and not just a Directorate of Sunni Islamic Affairs. And again, I would say the progress is minor, but it's real.
Any more questions?
Can ask a question. Just wanted to know your take on the presence and importance of state tradition. Because when one looks at Catholicism, the institution, though it had a long political history, in its original early form, it did not have an integral political system incorporated within it. It grew on it as it grew in influence. However, when one looks at Sunni Islam, it had a political tradition since its inception, from its very early days. So it could be said that one of the reasons that Catholicism managed to survive as an institution into a modern liberal world order was that it managed to leverage its original position as a spiritual institution with the Pope as a spiritual leader. With that, it managed to leverage itself into a favorable position and adapt. However, when it comes to Sunni Islam, we can observe that once the political tradition of Sunnism died, the presence of a caliph really would have been seen as redundant. Because a caliph, though, or the caliphate is a religiously important institution, at the end of the day, the caliph is still a political figure that is meant to have a sovereign authority. Yes, of course, the Pope still maintained a sovereign authority, but the sovereign authority is a minor aspect now grafted on the more essential spiritual authority. But now, with no political tradition alive within the sphere of Sunni political Islam, I don't see any way of adapting into a modern world. And this would directly also affect what you emphasized regarding the autonomy of Muslim communities abroad in Europe or even on a global scene, is because as long as Sunni Islam cannot put its own house in order, I don't see, even when there are minorities abroad, to act together. So what's your take on perhaps a continuation of the importance of Sunni political tradition into contemporary times?
Yeah, no, thank you very much. Excellent question. So I would say that these religions have gone through, are now operating, having passed through a nation state filter, right? That's just the sort of reality, is that the nation state is a very jealous monopolist and regulates and authorizes or doesn't authorize all activities, including nonprofit activities. Just the ability to call yourself a religious education, to benefit from the tax exemption or what have you, all of that is highly regulated. And all of that is highly unusual when you're a religious authority, because you're going to wait in line and get your little certificate stamped by the functionary to tell you who you are. You don't need that. You have religious authority, which is derived from your community or divinely or whatever, but certainly not from that guy behind the counter wearing a state uniform. Nonetheless, if you want to build your mosque, if you want to train your personnel, you have to get these certificate stamped. So that's a situation which is unnatural and uncomfortable for any religious authority that is used to enjoying sovereignty, that is used to being the one granting permission or withholding permission, and is not used to being on the receiving side of that. So that transition is a huge leap that for some, it ends the conversation right there, right? Because then you could say at that point, there's really no modern state in which you can live a good religious life, truly, because you're always going to be subject to some secular ruler who has not the proper authority to make certain types of decisions. So a lot of this book is sort of based on a premise that we're living now in this nation state world, right? It's a value neutral observation. I didn't choose it. We were born into it. And I can understand why some would, really prefer an imperial solution. I think about the minorities of the Middle East who have all disappeared since the nation state. It's an absolute tragedy. Algeria, North Africa used to be filled with religious minorities, Christians, Jews, all, who under different model of citizenship were able to coexist, perhaps not always to thrive, but certainly at least to exist, right? Whereas the nation state doesn't really abide by, the nation state has an initial difficulty with that kind of heterogeneity and that an initial impulse towards homogenization. So that's the sort of first level challenge that I think we kind of have to start with as our premise. And then I would say, look at the countries where you still do have Catholic rule. There are a few places on earth still that are ruled by canon law, and not just the Vatican City State, but the tiny, there are micro states essentially, like Monaco, Liechtenstein, Andorra, where you still have essentially, it is the religious ruler who is giving the political ruler the approbation and permission to rule. And that, from a religious perspective, is the right order of things. So I would not say that there's a natural acceptance of any division between the sovereignty, political sovereignty and spiritual authority. I would say it's a very unnatural division. And the ultimate outcome, and here it's important to kind of expand it from Roman Catholicism and look at this, say, as Christianity, because only then can you understand what the future of Islam internationally could look like, not should like or will look like, but could look like. Right now, the Pope is the head of one of the Christian churches, right? And just one. There are numerous competing religious authorities which also receive recognition by states. And the Pope just has to deal with that, right? The Pope has to deal with the fact that it's not just the Archbishop or the Cardinal who's invited to the presidential palace to receive the New Year's benediction. It's also the Orthodox Greek guy, and it's also the Anglican, and from Canterbury, and so there is a natural pluralism to this historical outcome that we sometimes are blind to because we take religious leaders' word for who they are, right? But in fact, you have to look at them in context of one another. So it's true, there's not going to be a caliph, a single caliph, but I would say today there's not a single pope, right? So it doesn't matter. There could be a number of religious authorities who have legal and spiritual legitimacy for their believers. And so clearly that's not going to take the form of a political religious caliphate in the kind of unitary sense, where the Ottoman Empire from 1517 to 1922 was, it wasn't the only game in town, but it was, like the papacy, a major player in its religious sphere. Not the only player, but the major dominant player. And so today, what I try to show in the book is that
it's not just going to be a matter of, okay, the Diyanet or, CIGA or somehow operating abroad is going to be the new caliphate, but it's going to be one sphere of influence over certain swathes of ethnic and national parts of the globe, and it may coexist and even overlap with other equally legitimate religious authorities like that of the Moroccan king. And you can say, well, it's not logical. How can you have both the Moroccan king and Diyanet be the legitimate representative of Islam? That's impossible. Well, it's as impossible as there being Bartholomew II and Pope Francis, right? It's the condition of religious history combined with the reality of the modern interstate system.
Thank you so much. Anyone? One else? Thank you so much, Professor Jonathan, for being with us today. Our director, Professor Samuel Arin, could not be here in person, but he listened to the whole presentation via Zoom. He thanked you, and he mentioned that it was a beautiful presentation. We hope to host you again, inshallah, in the center in future. Thank you so much for being with us today, and thank you for this enlightening presentation. Hopefully, we'll see some more work from your hand, inshallah, in future. Thank you so much. Jazakumullah khair.